People told me you all were really sharp, and I'm seeing that. Every time you see my hands cross, I want you to clap at exactly the same time. Ready? 1, 2, 3. See, I told you were smart. What were the instructions I gave?
So they actually crosswise.
Ready? Some people are going, wait. Let's see that again. You should see what I see. Now there are those in here that are incredibly confident about this, what you just said, but there are others who are still a little uncertain. Act with boldness. Hopefully what we're able to demonstrate here today is that sometimes things seem so obvious, but there are always things we miss. And I just appreciate our lead speaker here today, this afternoon, because that's exactly what he was illustrating. That we all have to be around the table in order for one person to identify what's actually going on for the rest of us to get some clue. And that's why it's so important that we are including one another around the table.
Okay, we're going to try this with the audio here. It's a little quiet, so hopefully this will work.
Before the decision, over the last 66 years, Rondo has lost more than half its population. There were once almost 3,000 homeowners in Rondo in 1956 before the decision to run I-94 highway to the heart of the Rondo community. That decision ultimately led to more issues than it solved.
Today, only half of the Rondo community still lives there due to the many issues I-94 caused. With the partnerships between ReConnect Rondo, Asakura, reignites, and you, the most important part of the community, we ask you to show up for the future generations to come, to create a space over the I-94 highway between the streets of Chatsworth Street North and Rondo Street North that will give way to a space that will create affordable housing, make space for education and business institutions, and reconnect the community to the growing roots that were stolen from Rondo and the generations that deserve access to the economy that they did not receive.
So I ask you, could we change the narrative of the community for the betterment of tomorrow and the future of the next 7 generations?
What would the space look like? Does the next 21 acres into the future include schools, maybe parks or places for business?
What can we do for tomorrow?
What if we bring back space and money for Rondo residents that was once stolen?
So I ask you, if you and your family were in Rondo, what would you use in the future?
Would you show up?
How could you help us get information tomorrow?
What would you do with a chance to create generations of it?
Could we reimagine tomorrow together? Over the last 66 years, Rondo has lost more than half its population.
In 1956, Interstate 94 tore through the heart of St. Paul's thriving African American Rondo neighborhood. ReConnect Rondo has a vision to bring prosperity back to Rondo by working to revitalize the Rondo community with a land bridge that reconnects Rondo and reignites a vibrant African American cultural enterprise district in St. Paul. Communities of color have historically been under
Sure. What we're looking at here is obviously an area of St. Paul in 1930 where there was a growing African American community. And so the dots that you see represents 5 individuals, each dot. And you can see there's a tremendous concentration of that population in that geographic space. Obviously, before the freeway came through itself. But it was a place once called home for many within the African American community.
Our speakers today are Keith Baker from ReConnect Rondo, Zakcq from Collaborative, and Lindsey Wallace from Wallace.
Great. I'm so glad to be here. For those that may not know, I'm from Duluth, so I'm in my hometown. And so I'm so glad to be here. Growing up here in Duluth as early as 1967, so quite a long time ago. I remember even dancing in this ballroom when I was a kid. So I don't think I've been here since then, and I'm not quite sure why. I might not have had a great experience, because maybe I couldn't get the young girl to dance with me at the time. Yes, maybe I was disappointed about it. But nonetheless. So I'm the executive director of ReConnect Rondo, so I'm so pleased to be here leading the effort to create an African American cultural enterprise district. We phrase that a little bit differently. Rondo was an African American cultural enterprise district before the freeway came through. And what's also important to recognize is we see the language itself as just a connective tool to reconnect that cultural enterprise district. So I'm so glad to be here.
Zakcq?
Hi, I'm Zakcq. I am a partner at Men Collaborative, and we are an urban planning, urban design, and landscape architecture firm. In my work, I focus on working with historic African American communities, but also historic working class communities more broadly at moments when they're experiencing a great deal of change. And so I've really gotten an opportunity to work around the country with any number of communities that are really seeking to take their future into their own hands as external forces are working in and around them as well. So I am currently managing a anti-displacement and community investment strategy along with the work that's being done in Rondo. So we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Hi everybody, I'm really loud. Hi everybody, I'm Lindsey Wallace. I'm the senior architectural historian and planner at 106 Group. We're a consulting firm that offers services in cultural resources, cultural heritage planning, and gentrification design. I am a part of the project team along with Regine over there, who has been our fearless leader here. And we are offering support in cultural and heritage research and resources to the project that I was mentioning. I have a background in planning and preservation and community development, so this is one of my first projects that I've gotten to work on at 106 Group, and I'm pretty lucky to have that come to conclusion. So happy to be here.
And as Lindsey mentioned, I'm Regine Kennedy with 106 Group. I'm the planning and engagement manager and a project manager on this project. Really honored to be working with Keith and Zakcq and our school team. Right. So ReConnect Rondo is leading a restorative movement, and this is going to be fairly informal as we present the background, so speakers feel free to jump in as you like. ReConnect Rondo has a very strong mission and a plan, as you can see here, and a very robust, multi-pronged approach. It's not just looking at one thing, but looking at how transportation and housing and arts and culture can all work together for the benefit of the community. The cultural district also is seeking to create new land, to preserve history, to protect residents, and to actualize community and regional prosperity while establishing better health and wellness outcomes. And they're not doing it single-handedly. It's taking a very large team of elected officials, people from the city and state. It's taking a lot of people to make this reality. And it's been a very hard-fought journey worth celebrating. And you can see the timeline here from the time when Rondo was a thriving community in the 1830s to the destruction caused by I-94 in the 60s, and then the first Rondo days held in the 80s. There have been a number of initiatives that have happened since then. The cap idea emerges, and that is really where the land bridge, the idea of the land bridge came. And the round table started meeting. They started thinking about how could this look better? How can this be better? How can the community drive the restoration? There's a commemorative plaza established. If you haven't seen it in St. Paul, I encourage you to stop by. And there was a formal apology in 2015 by Commissioner Zelli. In 2017, ReConnect Rondo formed. And since then, they have been working tirelessly with all of these stakeholders to bring things to where they are today. If you're not familiar with St. Paul, this is the location of the Rondo land bridge. So you can see it's just south of where the green line is and just west of downtown St. Paul, the capital. Lindsey, you want to walk us through a little bit of social history?
There we go. All right. So this is just a thumbnail sketch. There is a lot of reporting, a lot of resources on the history of the Rondo neighborhood that I highly encourage you to check out. There's a really wonderful oral history project that the Minnesota Historical Society has online. So this is just very quick, but we wanted to set the stage for the years and decades immediately before the highway came through, so you can better understand how rich the cultural heritage is in Rondo. So Rondo as a neighborhood, the residential development, commercial development of the built environment started in the 1890s as the streetcar line into University Avenue, which is just more, I think, close to where that green line was on the map that Regine showed. And so people were coming to the area to live, and then in the early 20th century, it was a predominantly Jewish and African American community. In 1920, Rondo Avenue was like a bustling commercial street. These are a few shots from the commercial area of Rondo in 1930. 50% of the residents in the Rondo neighborhood were Black. And in 1940, 90% of the African Americans in St. Paul were living in the Rondo neighborhood. And so we did, 106 Group did, not nothing credit, but it's a good context. In 2017, we did a context study on African American history in St. Paul, and Rondo was, of course, a centerpiece of that. But Rondo, the neighborhood, was really the center point, the crux of the arts, of civil rights activism, religion, professional growth organizations, and social clubs in St. Paul for the Black population. But in 1956, the city of St. Paul and other entities involved in the highway creation okayed the highway construction that basically destroyed most of Rondo Avenue, which was the heart of the neighborhood. And so 700 homes were lost, 300 commercial businesses were lost. And while some of the people who lived in the neighborhood continued to live in the neighborhood, many were displaced forcibly, which created somewhat of a neighborhood diaspora, which we are going to talk about. I'm going to pause there, but just know we're going to talk a lot more about Rondo. That isn't where the history stops, but it is a crucial point in this conversation.
Thank you. All right, we're getting into our first topic. We're going to discuss policies and practice. So the destruction of Rondo was a political decision based on racist policies to promote segregation. And we have 3 questions that the speakers will address, either together or in turn. So first question, how did this happen in the Rondo neighborhood? The second question is, what were the preservation, planning, development, and general governmental policies, practices, and tools at play in the mid-20th century and which persist today? And then how has historic preservation practice
start by saying, with respect to transportation, there was nothing in place. So the decision making that took place was the decision making that took place among city planners, the Department of Transportation, and the federal government. So absent those things, certainly intentionalities can occur. We think about NEPA today, the NEPA process, National Environmental Protection Act, that at least somewhat allows for guardrails, if you will. But within Rondo, certainly, it did not exist.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that, especially in the case of Rondo, these are longer stories than the highway in 1965. There's this history of intentionally depressing values in communities of color through redlining and other tactics that allowed many highway designers in the era of the 50s and 60s to make a case that these are just the areas that make the most sense to build them through because they're the areas with the lowest value, the least expensive for us to build them in these cases. One of the things that actually stands out in the case of I-94 is that there was actually an alternative route that would have done almost no displacement. It would have followed historic railway tracks. It was discounted because this would eliminate the housing and commercial district within Rondo communities. So there was an intentional choice, a documented intentional choice in this context to target this community, and that is not the case when you look at a lot of highway around the world. The intention, while having the same result, is often a little bit less clear from the way the documentation happened in the projects. I had the opportunity a week ago to see Dr. Kennedy speak, who has written a really wonderful set of books around racist ideas. And one of the ideas that he goes forward really strongly is that the arc of racist thought and anti-racist thought in the country hasn't been a set of steady progress. That every time anti-racist thought makes progress, racist ideas change in a way that can continue forward racist ideas as well. And so for me, it's been interesting to think recently about the ways that Rondo and the highways in general that are being built in this country are being built at the same time as the Civil Rights Act and are being built at the same time that we're actually seeing a sort of set of progress for African Americans in the United States, that they're an evolution of a racist idea that is coming at the same time for other progress being made in other ways. They're not sort of separate processes. And one of the things Dr. Kennedy said is that we should consider highways monuments to white supremacy in the same way that we consider a Confederate statue that as well. So just to kind of potentially change your thinking about the way that we think about the school that we use every day to go to work and school.
One of the things that I highlight this particular photo because in '65 there was an analysis done on the Twin Cities, because the Twin Cities was viewed as an incredibly well-planned city. And Rondo is threaded throughout this book. And it highlights the debate, the great debate that was going on between business, between community members, between planning officials, etc. Well, clearly, the political decision won. Because as Zakcq had mentioned, there's a northern route which would virtually not have taken out any homes. But yet you pick the very concentrated place where African Americans reside, 80% of that community. Urban renewal was also happening during this time. you've got the municipality participating, you've got the highway department participating, you have business interests participating. One interesting thing to highlight about the book was Minnesota was trying to position to be one of the first states to receive Federal Highway Act money. So it started acquiring homes or taking homes in order to stage advancement for development. So you can see the incredible devastation. But I'm also going to make one other point, and that has to do with the fact that when we think about the reignites left, Regine had mentioned 700 homes, 300 businesses. If those homes had not been taken, the current value today would be $157 million. It's staggering when you think about the amount of wealth that was taken away. So if you love reads and you love history and you want a reality check, this is a great, great book to dig into.
One other policy, I think, in that discussion, we were talking about highways and the entities involved that created the situation even before the highways, early after World War I, was restrictive covenants, which we haven't mentioned yet, but that is a racist housing policy in and of itself that restricted where Black people could buy homes. And unfortunately, those covenants are still on deeds, even though they're not enforceable anymore, but it's a very visible remnant of our racist housing policies that created both the good in terms of the cultural center of Rondo, but at a horrible cost.
I just want to speak to this idea in 2009 when the CAP, or language idea, surfaced. It was a time when the Central Light Rail corridor along University Avenue was being planned. There were no stops planned in Rondo. Just think about that. Does it sound like it's repeating itself? In 2009? So the community was furious about that. And ended up leading a lawsuit, filing a lawsuit in 2011, because the Environmental Protection Act, National Environmental Protection Act, the community felt, did not consider them. The arts, the culture, the history was not necessarily a factor in that process. I want to make that point because of the last question that certainly Regine had mentioned. And that question really centers on how it's changed. In some instances, not much, even though there is something currently in place.
I think that last question too, so for me as a practitioner, as an urban planner, that does focus on historic working class communities, and I use those words very specifically. I know in past lives, I probably said underserved communities and other things like that. I like to create more agency for the communities and the words that we choose. Most of the projects that I get brought into as a consultant around the country that are focusing on communities like that, I am not asked to bring historic preservation practitioners along on those teams. These are neighborhoods that are in many cases, they're just as historic, they have really incredible history and cultural legacies within them. But for the clients, the cities I'm working for, and even in the communities themselves, they often don't feel that they are places that history exists or history has worked with, and more often they're places where they feel history has been imposed on them, or that there has been some sort of disjuncture in way that history works. And so it's been very interesting for me, and I got now a couple of projects to get to work with 106 group, but we work on these projects across the country where just incredible histories can be brought up. I've worked on Hill District in Pittsburgh, which was the first community in the United States that had an ambulance service. Because at that time, police officers were expected to be the ambulances and they would go to a black neighborhood. And so they worked with the university and they trained people, and they developed this program, and they created something new. That's not something that's memorialized in the neighborhood, but it's something that's impacted every single part of our lives. But we're asked to come into that project, and that's just something that we uncover through conversations. We've worked in historically LGBTQ communities where, I worked in a community called Montrose in Houston where we learned through conversations that it had been regular practice for people to bury coffee canisters with the ashes of those who had perished during the AIDS epidemic in a parking lot of a certain bar. And those human remains were still there. It's just a coffee shop now, but this parking lot was actually this incredibly important site. But again, we're not asked to bring archaeologists or historic preservationists into these communities that people are not thinking about as the places where history is being made and lost. And so I hope that some of what we are seeing in the way that practice is changing over time is that we are creating respect for different communities who have not been a part of our historical narrative, and that we're going to see more opportunities for historic preservation practitioners to be a part of these sorts of work that we can celebrate, not just, and celebrate is the wrong word, because we don't want to celebrate what the highway was imposed in the community, but that we can celebrate the history of the culture and the community and the lived experience of those who were there and those who persisted as well.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And I think, one of the things that I was thinking about with that question is the preservationists, like I would call myself one of them, right? One of us. I think one thing that we can continue to do to further the changes in the practice is to find ways to be a part of conversations. The onus is on us too, right? It isn't up to a community who may have been, our part of Rondo was, and if they don't feel like history is a part of the conversation, we can build relationships, put ourselves out there. We have a rather niche field, right? And I think that the continued impact we can make is by putting ourselves out there and to work more with planners, work more with community developers, not just real estate, which is good, it's good to get outside of the box, but there are a lot of other areas that we need to push ourselves forward in order to be able to changes.
Okay, move on to the next set of questions. We have a few slides that I'm going to just pop through pretty quickly. You've seen this one. And then this is showing other highways that went through predominantly black neighborhoods. So it wasn't just 1984.
I just want to add that was a map from 1956. So again, people were aware of what they were doing.
I want to also mention and acknowledge South Minneapolis. You can see those, it's really something that's important to consider, that not only are we setting the conditions for what's going on in Rondo, but Regine is here, and I know she's been advocating many things in South Minneapolis that we see this movement being very much connected to historically.
And these maps always amaze me. There's another thing, and this one is specifically looking at African Americans, but the bend where the Lowry Avenue, or the Lowry Hill Bridge is there. Even in 1956, that was the predominant area where LGBTQ community in Minnesota was and continued to be. And there are specific examples of that community being targeted by urban renewal and by highway design too. So many stories in this part of history that are not apparent to us.
You're showing the destruction, and then Community impacts. The destruction of the Rondo neighborhood has affected the community and community members for generations. And Keith had alluded to this a little bit with the amount of generational wealth that has been lost. We have 3 questions related to this topic. To prevent this from happening again, here or in other communities, what regulatory areas can the public influence and how? What can or should be done to support projects led by and in service to communities of color? And how can preservation, planning, transportation, and development professionals make regulatory processes more transparent and accessible?
Well, one of the things that has become more and more present in the way that work is being done in the planning and transportation world is an understanding that we really need center equity. And we saw, in the previous presentation as well, being able to see, these descriptions, what does equity look like, what does justice look like. There's maybe another question, do people even like baseball when you look at that image? But one of the things that we need to come to terms with, and this is where I think historic preservation has a really incredible opportunity to be a key player in the way that equity can happen, is that it is ridiculous for me as an urban planner to go into a community that has been targeted and has had these types of projects happen to them year after year for generations and say, this next time it's going to be different, you guys can trust us. Without us acknowledging the past harm that's been done and the experience that those communities have had of having planning be something that happens to them instead of with them. And I hope that as we are continuing to sort of continue this reckoning, that as a profession for urban planners, landscape architects, all kinds of different professionals, we also need to be making strides to make sure that there's better representation in our fields, so that, whether we're talking about class or gender or race, there are people in the room making decisions who are listening and working with communities that actually look like communities that they're working with as well. And so I think that's a really, really important place where there has been some progress in the last few decades, and it's really a problem that starts way back in high school in terms of creating a pipeline of professionals who see themselves in these careers. But it's one that we absolutely have to address because, looking around this room, how many stories are not going to be represented?
I think you've really kind of set a good framework. I'll say this, that when we consider the intersections of jurisdictions, when we consider the role and functions of various offices and/or jurisdictions, we all know sometimes they don't even play well in the sandbox. With respect to transportation, the thing that is important to recognize is that oftentimes, even when we're asking community questions, the community is not sure what question you're asking. You know the intent and the meaning of the question you're asking. So the community, particularly communities that have been devastated, can tell you what they don't want. Harder to imagine beyond that, to tell you what they do want. Part of the reason why this project kind of emerged the way that it did is that the Department of Transportation was going through its regular NEPA process that began in 2016, community engagement through 2018, phase 1, right? I attended probably the last meeting of this group called Community Leaders. And I'm observing representations of various community groups. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know that anybody's on the same page about any of this. So I began to facilitate a meeting to ask the question, what are you hearing? What are you understanding that you're being asked? What is it that you're trying to express? So that now let's level set where MnDOT is in its process and express to them where we clearly see the gaps. Because MnDOT thinks it's gone through a process and is convinced it has received feedback, but it doesn't necessarily reflect what actually the community wants to express. So that's just an illustration. So, what do? Well, we make sure that we have as much expertise, and Regine showed this circle with all these connected parts to it, right? You organize it from a community's perspective, and you put as much expertise around the table as the Department of Transportation has itself. So things don't get lost in translation, but it allows the community now to lead and ask MnDOT the questions in MnDOT's process that work in their interest, such as what is a highway purpose? And it can be interpreted in a wide range of ways. So I think it's important just to keep in mind the confluence of jurisdictions. I think it's important to recognize that oftentimes the processes that we're responsible for don't necessarily get us to the real information that we need to know.
I think connected to that, specifically with regards to preservation and how preservation practices regulated and what is determined eligible, et cetera, I think it's important for preservationists when they're a part of the conversations like that to not come at the conversation from the angle of, well, we have 35 eligible properties and that's all we're going to talk about. In communities like Rondo and others that have experienced that purposeful destruction, there has been an absence of anyone, pushing forward these kinds of preservation efforts from the formal perspective. And so there are a lot of people who have a lot more expertise in the history and the culture and what's important, whether it's still there or it was, to tell the history, to capture that history. And I think it's important as you're approaching these kinds of projects to listen, to set up the conversation so that you're not just talking about things that you can inventory later, but the pieces of history and culture that are critical to the people at the table that you're talking to, that live in the neighborhood, and then work with them to figure out how they want those stories to be told, right? There's a lot of different ways to do that. It's not just the National Register, which does have a lot of value, in a lot of ways, but we can think outside the box, and we should just generally.
Add something about that second question too, this issue of what can be done to support projects led by and service to community of color. I want to stop on those two words and how important they are, led by and in service to. This issue of me as a white professional working with the community of color, too often working to extract stories, to extract conversation, to extract feedback from a community of color in service of something that I need professionally in order to move something forward without compensation, without really allowing the community to lead in moving forward what they actually want. And that's again, following Anton Schroeder is a difficult thing, because so much of what he said is still resonating with me as well, that we all have to acknowledge that we operate in racist structures within professions that have developed racist structures, and that we are going to do racist things in our professional practice. And we need to be able to figure out how to acknowledge that without the old poor me, I'm a bad person, and really begin to find ways to do better and move forward and listen to the communities that we're working with, listen to the other professionals we're working with. I felt, I don't know if anyone saw it, but there was a op-ed in the New York Times this last week written by the person who actually runs that segregation by design Instagram, talking about a highway project in Houston. And it's a project that I worked on for a previous client. It's a project that I don't think I would do it the same way, knowing what I know now. And it's hard to admit that. It's hard to look at something like that and be like, oh, what I worked on is probably on the balance more destructive than productive. And we had a lot of good reasons. There were a lot of things that made sense in the way we did it, but that is hard to do. And then I have this other thing, which is I'm an AICP, and our professional code of ethics says that we can't say anything bad about a project that we worked on for 5 years. So my time is up this year. I can say that now, that I'm not happy with the way that particular thing moved forward. But again, there are these structures that are in place that keep us from being able to acknowledge and learn from what we do and have done wrong and will continue to do wrong as we move forward.
I can just ask you just to go to the next slide for a second. Because again, we've got to really understand, oftentimes, particularly in this instance, Rondo, again, why it's hard for communities to trust processes and the institutions. So there's a great guardedness as well as the questions are being asked. But let's just think about it. Again, $157 million of loss. But let's think about what the mental loss is. The scorecard of Rondo. By each of these measures, Rondo ranks net negative. So when people talk about equity and inclusion, let's be clear about what we're saying. If this is at net negative, how do you get people to par? I would argue, to some extent, before the freeway came through, African Americans were progressing to par. But it's not enough to be at net zero, if you will. It's really important to gain equity in all of these particular measures. So that's what this project is really about. But it's got to stitch together. If you can imagine a piece of paper, you tear up that piece of paper, and then you throw that piece of paper up into the wind, and it scatters. How do you find all of those pieces of paper? And if you're lucky enough to find a few, how do you figure out what end of the paper goes with what end of the paper? So this becomes very, very challenging for communities that not only have been devastated, but they want to preserve their history. They want to tell their stories. They want to move forward whole, if you will. And the roles that you all play should be very intentional about trying to help folks find the whole of what it is that is happening.
We have a few slides to go through, then we'll move on to our next topic. So this is showing the Rondo commemorative plaza. It was very much a community-driven memorialization of the neighborhood. There are wonderful quotations and pictures there. And then we also have this graphic called Actualizing Existing Policies. Pete, did you want to speak a little bit about this?
I spent 18 years working for the Department of Transportation, so that's why I can talk about this. But I don't think it's limited to the Department of Transportation. I think it's any organization, any state agency where policies are city, where policies are put forward. You know, so often the policies are right, but the programmatic design faulty. And those responsible for implementing faulty. But again, the policies are often right. NEPA is right. And it's important to recognize that as we think about the project, the Rondo project, there's a bullet missing here. And I think it's really important to acknowledge. We look at certainly the Met Council's Thrive 2040 plan. We look at the city's comp plan. We look at Ramsey County Economic Competitiveness Plan. But what is missing? What's missing is what's the state's preservation plan in the context of Rondo. What is the city's preservation plan in the context of Rondo or any? So how do we pull the drawstring through, all the way through, to identify the intersections, if you will, of these plans and preservation? If we're intentional about it, I think we can get to some really wonderful outcomes.
The third and final topic is stakeholders. So the destruction and regeneration of Rondo is widely known in the Twin Cities, and there have been many interested stakeholders with differing opinions. We talked a little bit about this. But here are the two questions we're going to ask our speakers. With community-led regeneration as a project goal, how might stakeholders work through differing strategy approaches in a constructive, collaborative way? And how will the community input influence the project design and outcome?
I think you have to start by defining what community-led regeneration is, and that through their incredible work, ReConnect Rondo has brought forward this concept of an African American cultural enterprise district, right? And that's not something, does that mean it only includes African Americans? No, it means it's something African Americans are leading and pushing forward. Is it a preservation strategy to ensure that, there's enough affordable housing? Yes and no, right? There's all these different elements to that, but really at its core, it's about generating culture and activity in ways that create wealth-building opportunities in a constructive way in order to move forward. And so, like, for my work in this, which is really thinking about this idea of anti-displacement and community investment, and maybe another way to say that is, how do we do development without gentrification? Those are kind of slightly different ways of saying the same words. A big answer to that is community control, which means that stakeholders need to be brought in a way that actually gives them skin in the game. And that might include actually owning a portion of a real estate investment trust and actually getting dividends from development that's happening in the community. It might involve community developed projects, and that's kind of what we're here to find out in terms of really working through these sorts of ideas with people. We were discussing it with my team yesterday, and someone just had a really important insight that I think can get lost in thinking about gentrification and displacement as purely financial tools. So we had a lot of these questions. We've seen University of Minnesota go out and do studies about where is gentrification happening and what is it. They define it in terms of very specific financial properties that are happening in a specific community. What's important about what Rondo is bringing forward is that we're not stopping on the finances. We're talking about culture. We're talking about where people feel comfortable, where they have opportunity, where they have opportunities to bring up families, where young people have opportunities to start businesses, and really pushing forward a different idea. Because I think in a lot of cases, people aren't displaced by the financial conditions in their neighborhood. They're displaced because they don't feel comfortable anymore, because the businesses don't serve them, because the cultural facilities don't serve them, because their stories aren't being told in those communities. So bringing that into the way that we're starting to think about this, I think is a really important piece. And another piece where telling stories is so massive to be able to create this vision on the ground.
And along those same lines, I'm thinking more through that culture and heritage lens, because that's my role in this project. But one of the things that we've talked about as one of the stakeholders in this really great comprehensive team is that we don't want to think about the built environment or these sites as completely separate from these other comprehensive goals, right? So when we think about, okay, there's this really amazing commercial building that was built in 1902 and it's vacant, and part of what we want to do with that is think about how can this building support entrepreneurship, how can this building support community wealth building. It doesn't have to be, used to recruit businesses from somewhere else. It can be about building that wealth locally. So thinking about the built environment in terms of continued use, in terms of actually the people that will be using these buildings day in, day out. That's the critical element.
So now, if you really think about it, just imagine the Department of Transportation not involved in a transportation project except as a stakeholder or partner. How many in the room would say, MnDOT is ready for that? Raise your hand. Am I the only one who believes that? Part of the point that I really want to get at is this. You've got a corridor titled Rethinking 994 from St. Paul to Minneapolis. MnDOT is responsible for the process, which also ties in cultural resources. 106, section 106, right? What if a community says, we don't like the way this is going, so we want to lead it. And literally, what ReConnect Rondo has been able to do is to take the section that we're describing between Dale and Lexington, which is, an area approximately a mile, right? And we say, we're going to control that. Now, the word control makes people really nervous, right? But that's exactly what we've done. We've said to MnDOT, because MnDOT is still in a process. So when we think about running a marathon, who leads in the marathon sets the pace? Well, that's what ReConnect Rondo has done. Is we've carved out a section that we want reflecting the culture and the history of African Americans, and we said we'll do the National Environmental Protection Act work. We're going to lead and teach MnDOT and the jurisdictions how to really get this done and still get to the outcomes that ultimately help the community prosper as a whole. It's an unprecedented proposition. It's unprecedented that a nonprofit organization leads a transportation project. But being community-led it matters. We had an incredible event kicking off our master planning process. And we had about 105 cross-generational participants, from elders to descendants to the broader African American community, and sprinkled here and there, or white people. The energy was extraordinary. So while it's not always the case that people understand the processes, the systems, the tools, and the resources, but we ought not be fooled into thinking people don't want to be involved and to own their stories. And so I do think that we've set conditions and we're modeling something different that people are paying attention to. And I do think that it's important as in the work of Section 106 and the work that others do around history preservation to know is that we've got a great organization called Hallie Q. Brown. Hallie Q. Brown has been archiving information for a long time. This story of Rondo. It's a great organization partner. There's another organization at commemorative Plaza called the Rondo Center for Diverse Expression. It is collecting every written book, article, paper on the story of Rondo. So the community is very interested, but it does want to be supported, and it does want to lead its effort to collect and to interpret and to present its own information.
Thanks, Doug. I know we're running a little bit behind. That is all of our questions, but I do want to give the audience an opportunity to ask any questions. So any questions from the audience?